In this lecture, I have a few things I want to do. I want to talk about the compare and contrast essay prompt because we have transitioned from essay 2 to essay 3. I also want to say something about the compare and contrast outline. If you look in the compare and contrast module on D2L, you'll see immediately under the prompt is an outline. I'll say a bit about that because one of the things, at least from my experience talking and working with students, one of the things that makes compare and contrast as not only a pattern, but also as an essay a bit more challenging is just how much work and how much logistical organization is required of you, because in addition to selecting a topic, you also need to think about the different subjects you want to write about. You need to think about the different points you want to make about those subjects. And I'll explain and explore those terms in just a few minutes. But the point is, having an understanding of how you can organize a compare and contrast essay, because there are a few different ways, is important because it'll help keep just all of this information together. And as always, as a way of perhaps showing you or explaining what a compare and contrast essay can look like and what it can do, we will discuss the Ellen Laird essay on internet education or delivering education online. So let's start with just the prompt. And again, to find the prompt, go to D2L, go to the Content tab, and click on the Essay 3 Compare and Contrast module. You should see, the first thing you should see is that Compare and Contrast essay prompt. Open it now, and I won't read the whole thing, but I will highlight a couple of important pieces of information. So I think where I want to start is just with this example. So this is the second sentence of the prompt, and I will read from here. For example, I want you to imagine that you could write about a running shoe brand. So perhaps the question you might ask is, which shoe brand is best, Nike or Puma? As you can see, this question implies that one of these two running shoe brands will, for example, increase one's ability to run faster, to run more efficiently, etc. And it does that because of the question I ask, which running shoe brand is the best? I don't, for example, ask which shoe is the best, because shoes, of course, can do different things. Sometimes we use shoes just to cover our feet. Sometimes, like with this example, we use them for athletic endeavors like running, playing golf, basketball, etc. So the first thing that I want to bring to your attention is how the specificity with the question you ask will certainly help to guide you in particular directions. And you want this question you ask to be as specific as possible. And this is something that I've mentioned throughout the semester, the importance of, maybe before doing anything else, in that brainstorming space, just think about the question you want to ask and the question you want to explore. This is so incredibly important with compare and contrast, because it will help you structure and organize not only your thoughts, but also your essay. Having such, and I'll continue reading from here, having such an implication is one of the requirements of this assignment, so be sensitive to that. When searching for your essay's implications, be specific. Notice I do not simply ask which shoe is the best, I ask which running shoe is the best. I also narrow my focus by comparing and contrasting two brands instead of 4 or 5. So I want to stop here for a moment as well, because one of the requirements, and I say this now, and I hope everyone listens to this, because selecting multiple subjects, so if we wanted to use this running shoe, this hypothetical running shoe compare and contrast essay as an example, you'll notice I don't select 3 or 4 or 5 possible brands, even though I could. I just select 2. And I would encourage you to limit your subjects to 2, because the more subjects you have, the bigger and more complicated the essay gets. And for this class, for this assignment, we just want to keep this simple. So choose no more than 2 subjects. Here are other questions you can and should ask yourself, again, in that brainstorming space, just as a way of generating ideas. What will my reader learn after reading this essay? How can a reader how can a reader apply this information to enrich their lives? Why does this matter? Am I generalizing? If so, how can I remedy that problem? And some of these questions, these are, again, the kinds of questions that might help you shape your essay. It might help you refine your topic, but some of them, quite frankly, may not be applicable to your topic, and that's not necessarily a problem. For example, if someone were to read my hypothetical essay about running shoes, if they are not a runner, then, well, perhaps they can't apply a lot of the information from my essay, and that's not necessarily a problem. Again, I want you to understand that you don't need to select a topic that thoroughly addresses all of these brainstorming questions that I have given you. But something else I want you to think about, I do not necessarily want you to do research for this assignment, and what I mean by that is, because we will get to research later. I don't want, if you were to do an essay like the one I propose in the prompt, I don't want reviews of these shoes. I want your thoughts, your feelings, your impressions. Now, I always offer this caveat. If you need to just double check, for example, perhaps Nike uses a proprietary bit of technology that has a special trademarked name, and you need to just Google it to double check, that's different. That is not necessarily research. I would consider research finding, again, a review or an academic study on the effectiveness of different running shoes. That's the sort of thing for this assignment that I want you to avoid. But if you just need to do a bit of Googling so that you know the terminology, maybe you know the dimensions. Again, just imagine you are writing an essay about these running shoes. Maybe you need to know the weight of the shoes. Maybe that's important to the argument you want to make. That's okay. But if you have questions, please contact me because I can help to clarify the difference between just those general questions that you need to know and understand to write anything and research that is, again, something that I want us to save for the research essay. Here on the prompt, you'll notice that I also want you to address a potential counter argument. I will talk about this more probably next week. I may have time later in this lecture to do this, but at some point I will talk about what this means. And finally, the minimum word count is 800 words. And like the two previous essays, you will just submit a digital copy to D2L. Please don't forget, this is important. I wanted to mention this. I will read rough drafts. I would encourage you to submit rough drafts sooner rather than later. And when I read them, I will offer feedback. For Essay 2, as I am recording this, very few, if any of you, have submitted to the rough draft folder. That could be a problem. Just keep that in mind. The rough draft folders are there. You should submit to them and receive feedback. And please remember, I think I mentioned this at some point in an audio lecture, if you submit a rough draft the day before an assignment is due, I probably won't have time to read it and offer any feedback. So try to get those rough drafts to me as soon as possible. And I would say that's particularly important with this essay. Okay. Again, if you have any questions, you can always contact me, but let's spend a bit of time talking about the outline, which on D2L, that's the document or the attachment just below the prompt. So I certainly won't read this entire outline, but what I want to bring to your attention, and I mentioned this earlier, are the two different methods you can use when structuring and writing a compare and contrast essay. The first is point by point, and the second is subject by subject. So the thing I want you to think about is just how do I want to organize my essay? Which do I think would be best for me as the writer, and which of these two methods might allow me to best and most effectively communicate my thoughts and my points and my arguments to my reader? Because some of you, if you're just looking at these two methods, you're perhaps thinking, well, that point by point method, it looks a bit messy. There's a lot of particular details. I could imagine myself getting a bit lost if I tried to write that essay. By contrast, the subject by subject, it's a bit simpler. I could imagine myself easily writing that essay, even though, again, I am basically writing the same amount. And that's important because if you feel confident about how you are writing your essay, if you feel confident about the structure you use, then it'll just make not only the writing process easier and better and not as cumbersome, it will translate into a better reading experience for your reader. And I gestured towards this just a second ago, but I wanted to say a quick something about the strengths and weaknesses of each of these methods. The point-by-point method, you could argue, is a bit more combative and argumentative because you organize the essay with each of your points, because within perhaps each paragraph or section, you will write about each of your subjects. The reader the entire time has this clear sense that this is, in fact, a compare and contrast essay, and it can retain some of that combativeness that perhaps the compare and contrast model uses and utilizes. But one of the weaknesses, perhaps, or one of the potential problems, it can feel a bit messy, and for some students, it can be a bit hard to organize a point-by-point compare and contrast essay. So that's something to think about with the point-by-point method. It can feel a bit argumentative, it can feel more argumentative and more combative, but it can also feel a bit unorganized and a bit messy. Now, by contrast, the subject by subject, one of the strengths, it's a bit cleaner, it's perhaps better organized because you have ostensibly divided your essay into these two sections, one about one subject, one about another. And because of that, again, for you, it might be easier to write because things are neat and tidy and organized. One of the potential limitations of this method, it may not feel as argumentative because it may feel like you've sectioned off your essay in this way that strips it of some of that combativeness that I mentioned was a strength for the point-by-point method. So this is just something I want you to think about because, again, the way you choose to write your essay, broadly speaking, the method that you adopt or approach, it will either make this essay easier for you or harder for you if you don't spend just a bit of time thinking about how you want to structure your essay. Okay, as always, if you have any questions, please contact me, but I want to spend a little time talking about the Ellen Laird essay. And the title of this piece is I'm Your Teacher, Not Your Internet Service Provider. Now, the opening paragraph, the introduction, this is a clever and interesting way to start, and I'll just read a bit of it, so follow along with me. The honeymoon is over. My romance with distance learning is losing its spark. Gone are the days when I look forward to each new online encounter with my students, when preparing and posting a basic assignment was a thrilling adventure, when my colleagues and friends were well-wishers, cautiously hopeful about my new entanglement. What remains is this instructor alone, often in the dark of night, facing the reality of my online class and struggling to make it work. So you'll notice she deploys this marriage or romance metaphor. Notice the particular words she uses, words like honeymoon, romance, entanglement. And the question I think she wants us to think about is, well, why is that such an appropriate metaphor when thinking about online education? Because you might think initially that it's not. But I think the point she wants to make or the connection that she attempts to draw is, well, the internet, and she wrote this back in 2003, but I think for us still today, what I am about to say resonates. There's this sense that the internet just is this new space and this new terrain where we could experience something different and potentially magical and transformative and life affirming. And we often use that kind of language when we think about and talk about romance, marriage, etc. So I think for her, it's not so much the lie of internet education or teaching online, but it's the way that once all of that excitement dwindles and you start to see it for what it is, or you start to live with it for a while, you realize that it wasn't this wonderful, transcendent thing that you initially thought it was. And I suspect if you are listening to this, you've perhaps experienced that with a relationship or in a romantic situation. Those first couple of weeks, those first couple of months, you just thought everything your partner did was spectacular and fantastic, and how could you ever imagine getting bored of this person or finding their quirks and idiosyncrasies annoying, but give it a bit of time. And again, I'm not trying to suggest that romantic relationships are all just inherently bad. I am married, for example, but my point is those feelings you had at the beginning, they are not sustainable, and they don't actually represent what any particular relationship or romantic endeavor is. It's so different from, as Laird describes, that honeymoon period. And it's only at that point that you can start to assess, well, what is this thing really after, for lack of a better phrase, the shine is off of it. And I think that's what Laird really wants to explore and unpack in this essay. Because the promise of internet education, or the promise of education online, is a rather seductive one, right? It'll allow people in different geographic regions who have schedules that perhaps aren't conducive to a traditional college schedule to experience education in the way that someone who perhaps doesn't have those limitations can. But I think what Laird ultimately wants to understand is, well, is that promise real? Are you getting online what you get? Is it comparable to what you get in a classroom, in a traditional classroom? Or are all of those promises just sound and fury? And it's actually something totally different. And especially for her as an instructor, what are some of the problems delivering education online? Some of the problems that might actually hinder or prevent someone like Laird from doing her job effectively, which, if we just wanted to simplify it, it's educating people. So I think that's one of the questions she wants to explore as well, even though there are certain benefits to teaching online. Does it produce more harm than it otherwise would, or is there more bad than good with this new education modality? And I won't talk about all of the examples that she mentions, but I will say this. We were discussing the different methods, whether it's point by point or subject by subject. I would encourage you to pause for a minute and think about this essay. Is this a subject by subject or a point by point? And I think on the whole, this is a point by point compare and contrast essay. But even though I won't talk about all of the particular examples or particular points, there is one that I want to mention, or a couple that I want to mention. And it's the paragraph that begins with, there are no sick or personal days in cyberspace. There are no sick or personal days in cyberspace. In my traditional classes, I refrain from informing students that I will be out of town for a weekend, that I need a root canal, or that my water heater failed before work. My face-to-face students can read my expression, and bearing when they see me. Thus, I can usually keep personal explanations to a professional minimum. In my online classes, however, students cannot see the bags under my eyes or the look of exuberance on my face. They cannot hear the calm or the shake in my voice. Thus, for the smooth functioning of the course, I willingly provide details about where I am and what I am doing so students can know what to expect. And I think if we just wanted to unpack the larger point she wants to make here, it's one that we hear often when people criticize behavior on the internet, and it might sound something like this. Digital communication has the effect of dehumanizing the users. We all become not human beings who, if you saw us in person, you could see just from the way our body might look or the way we carry ourselves, perhaps the complexion of our skin, right? For someone who's extremely tired, again, she mentions bags under her eyes. Online, there's none of that. Instead, online, it's just engaging with and communicating with an avatar, frankly. And I think for someone like Laird, that's really part of the problem, because it seems one of the implicit arguments she wants to make here is that education, when delivered effectively, is a deeply personal and a deeply human endeavor. And to depersonalize it the way the internet has might put all of us in positions that, again, are not conducive to a good educational environment. Because she even says in the next paragraph, because a student can't see either the anxiety or the happiness just on her face or the way she carries herself, because all of that communication is lost online, she's then forced to communicate rather personal details about herself that perhaps any one of us would not want to communicate to a class. The next paragraph seems to imply that she needed to tell her students that she would not be in a position to communicate because of her father's funeral. And perhaps that's something she would want to keep private, but because of again, how the internet can have this effect of depersonalizing us and to some degree dehumanizing us, well, she was left with no recourse other than to just disclose this information. And I think part of the problem here, and again, I think you just see this with the next paragraph, despite disclosing that information, that didn't stop a student from attempting to email her. And I can only imagine, and I think her point is basically this: if a student saw her in class, in a traditional classroom environment, and she had to disclose in front of everyone why she couldn't return an email over the weekend, I wonder if any of her students, or this student in particular, would even send that email. So she seems to also argue that, again, one of the problems with just the mechanics of the internet is it seems to afford all of us the opportunity to break and breach decorum, the kind of decorum that we would never break or breach in a traditional face-to-face classroom. And another example that I want to mention from the essay is this sense that Laird seems to argue that for not just education and not just classes to function correctly and properly, but perhaps for society to function properly, there perhaps needs to be certain hierarchies. Notice she mentions a word like egalitarian in one of the closing paragraphs. I am not on your buddy list. The egalitarian atmosphere of the internet chat room transfers rapidly and inappropriately to the online classroom. Faceless and ageless online, I am, at first, addressed as a peer. If students knew that I dressed like many of their mothers, or that my hair will soon be more gray than brown, would their exchanges with me be different? I reveal what I want them to know: the date of my marathon, my now deceased dog's consumption of a roll of aluminum foil, my one gig as a cocktail lounge pianist, but little of what one good look at me in my jumper and jewelry would tell them. They, on the other hand, hold nothing back. Confessional writing, always a challenge in composition, can easily become the norm online. So can racist, sexist, and otherwise offensive remarks. Even admissions of crimes. The lack of a face to match with a rhetorical voice provides the illusion of anonymity and thus the potential for a no holes barred quality to every discussion thread. The usual restraint characterized conversation among classroom acquaintances evaporates online within about 2 weeks. Private conversations fuse with academic discussion before an instructor can log on. So a couple of things here. The first, and I would just challenge you to think, is Laird right? Is society at its best when there are these hierarchies? Because I think you could argue that perhaps one of the problems with just society, but also with educational environments, are these strict hierarchies. But sometimes, just to offer a counter argument, students have confessed to me that one of their problems with online education is they don't actually have a feeling of that hierarchy. They don't feel like there is someone else in control, because so much of online education is self-driven and self-motivated for each student, is a situation where students must drive and guide themselves. They are not only the student, but in many cases, the authority figure. And for a lot of students, that can feel a bit disruptive. But part of what Laird also argues here is there's a way that conversation and discourse on the internet just functions and operates differently from how it does and would in, again, a more traditional face-to-face environment. And this is something, I think this is something we often talk about, especially with social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, how someone will tweet something that they would never say to a person. So another way that I would encourage you to engage with this essay is to just simply ask the question, do you think Laird is still right? Is it still do we still behave in this way, or is there something about what she says here and what she ultimately argues that is a bit of a generalization? Has she maybe taken one or two bad experiences and from that extrapolated out, and now she offers this just blanket argument about online education? Do you feel like people, when they respond to discussion forums for a college class, don't actually behave the way they do when they're on Facebook or Twitter? Since Laird wrote this in 2003, have we increased and enhanced our internet literacy to the point that we can actually differentiate between those different platforms? And because we can differentiate, we behave differently. Again, I'm curious to know what you think about this. But the last thing I want to say, in a way of perhaps finishing this conversation, is to look at the conclusion, because after everything she writes in this essay, you would think she would conclude, and this is why online education can't work, doesn't work, shouldn't work, and universities and colleges should just discontinue it as a practice. But that's not what she does. Again, there's this interesting turn here at the end, because she says, for someone to teach online, they must, quote, brace themselves for a marriage of opposites and build large reserves of commitment, patience, and wherewithal if the relationship is to succeed. So again, returning to this marriage metaphor that she introduced at the beginning. But what I think is really interesting about this conclusion, again, is how she might surprise some of you and some readers who are reading this for the first time, because to this point, you could almost predict what she would say at the end as a way of capping her argument. But she doesn't do that. She moves in a different direction. And I would just ask you, why do you think she does that? And is that an effective choice? Would you have preferred Laird to end this essay by declaring online internet education is more of a problem than anything else, and we should discontinue it and find a different instructional method, or we should argue for and lobby for different sorts of interventions that might allow people who would choose online education to instead have the finances and the flexibility to take a traditional class in a traditional classroom. It is an interesting turn. And I think this is one of the ways that Laird shows us what an argument and a thesis statement and a compare and contrast essay can ultimately look like. It doesn't need to be a situation where your thesis statement is either or, traditional education or online education. She actually broadens, I would argue, our understanding of what a thesis statement for a compare and contrast essay looks like, because it seems like what she wants to argue and the point she arrives at here at the end is, well, what does one need to do online education that one would potentially not need to just teach classes in a traditional college classroom? Again, this is less about which one is better and which one is worse, and it's more about what new skills might someone in her position, a professional educator, need to do this one form of education or to deliver education in this new way that you wouldn't necessarily need to deliver education in this older, more traditional model. And I think for that way, again, she gives us a picture of what a thesis statement for a compare and contrast essay can ultimately look like. Okay, I think that's where I want to stop for today. I will remind you that the rough draft folder for this essay, it is now available. You may submit to it whenever you like. If you have any questions about topics, points you want to make, how to organize your essay, if you have a good topic or not, you can always email me, and I would encourage you to do so. But again, submit to that rough draft folder, and I attempt to provide feedback within 24 to 48 hours. So please do that. Okay, I look forward to talking to you next week, but until then, this is Colin Cox, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.